Good evening, and I'm here to talk about our Chapter 12 assignment in regards to diversity and equality as it pertains to education, and specifically looking at the views and philosophies of William Julius Wilson and Jonathan Kozol, and taking a look at some of their influential marks on education, especially dealing with inequality as it deals with minorities, and also looking at poor inner city schools and low-income students, especially Kozol focused on. And really what it comes down to, a lot of the stuff with going through the chapter and reading through it, really comes down to equality and equity, and really what's the difference between the two. And equality really refers to obviously things being equal and everyone getting the same type of opportunities, no matter race, gender, or socioeconomic status, versus equity, meaning fair, and everyone getting the same treatment regardless of socioeconomic status or race and gender. And for a very, very long time, a lot of educators and theorists, we have dealt with a lot of the origins of inequality, as far as where does it come from, and how do we stem the tide with a lot of this issue, because obviously a lot of the issues we're seeing today are things that have been around for quite some time, which is obviously rather unfortunate. The 1954 Supreme Court ruling of Brown versus Board of Education basically had stated that every child, regardless of race, should be given the same opportunity to become educated and eventually become employed. This was, as we talked about a little bit in previous chapters, one of the major steps in the right direction as far as equality and equity. But as we learn here, as we go through and read about Wilson's work and Kozol's work, we still have a long ways to go as it pertains to minorities in education, also lower income, inner city type schooling and things there. We have a long way to go with that. One of the first men we'll look at, very influential education, was William Julius Wilson, American sociologist, who holds very strong views on race and poverty as it pertains to disadvantaged African Americans. As I was reading through a lot of his stuff, I found some really, really interesting things, as far as his stance on some issues there, and it really spoke to a lot of, some very, very, really present a lot of intriguing questions and things that we look at today as educators. Are we doing enough to try to promote, equity and equality in our own classrooms and our schools? Basically, we talked about the Board of Education rule in 1954, and it was believed that it removed a lot of racial barriers. The African American population would also be free of inequality. And basically, Wilson was very, very quick to say that because of racial inequality, it had been ingrained in society for so long, with so much of that going on for such a long amount of time, it's very difficult to remove the mindset even if the racial barriers are being removed. And even people thinking after that ruling, by the mid-1970s, we'll be rid of all racial inequality, or in the 80s or 90s, whatever it may be. That has unfortunately not been the case, and we still have a lot of issues today with racial inequality, what we see there. And basically, by removing racial barriers, it gives more advantage to higher educated minorities. Basically, Wilson made some very interesting comments in the effect of, over time, people tend to develop advantages because the resources are being passed on from parents. Obviously, those individuals that have more outlets at a younger age are going to have a better chance of becoming more successful. I thought that was very interesting. I thought it was, very pertinent to what we're talking about here, and I thought it made a lot of sense. Wilson also went on to talk a lot about today's economy and comparing disadvantaged blacks to advantaged blacks when it comes to how it's changed. Basically, because of our computer tech world and things there that we have today, basically there seems to be a wider gap between low-skilled versus high-skilled workers, especially when it comes to African Americans, what we see there. And because a lot of disadvantaged blacks do not have technology readily available, basically he believes it's very, very hard for a lot of them to find jobs in our new technological age. And I think once again there's something to be said for that. If you're not given the resources, or you're not familiar with that stuff, it's going to make those individuals that are more highly skilled much more apt to being hired and having better jobs, obviously making more money, and it's obviously a trickle-down effect from there. Also, he had some interesting things to say about where the income for blacks is also going, and some interesting numbers that he threw out there. Basically, he said if you divide it up into, no matter if you're looking at blacks or whites, whoever it is, but if you take a look at, we call it quintiles, and we divvied up the total income, basically 50% of the total black income is being secured by the very top quintile, which means that you have an area where you have really highly skilled workers getting half of what the total income is, versus 44% of the white income is also coming in from the top quintile. So a little discrepancy there, but we're seeing a major part at the top, and then it all filters down from there. And I found those numbers to be very interesting because it really we're seeing a kind of a balancing out effect between African American workers versus white American workers. Those numbers are fairly close, 50 and 44%. And so there's also seems to be a bigger and bigger gap between those quintiles as you go from the very top as you work your way down through. I thought that was kind of interesting to look at. He also had some interesting views on the marginal or middle class African American workers, basically saying that those as we continue down the road of technology and in those higher skilled workers, we have more outlets and they're continuing to push forward. It's going to basically cause even a bigger gap from our lower or even middle class workers, and basically the higher paying jobs will become much more difficult for individuals that are not as highly skilled. And I think he had a lot of things on the head there as far as that, mainly because of where we're heading with technology and what it takes a lot of times to achieve some of those other types of jobs. There are some very interesting things there. And one of the last things I thought was interesting that he talked about was some of the inner city joblessness. That was a lot of what his book When Work Disappears was all about. And basically it said that in the 1950s and 60s almost 3 out of 4 African American males were working and maintaining some type of prosperity. You fast forward to the 1990s, especially early on, that number was down to 37% already. So we're seeing a major decrease in the amount of inner city jobs and what's going on there, and we'll continue to see that trend, which is obviously real alarming. So overall, Wilson was asked at one time, as I went on to read some more of his stuff, what do we do about the problem of racial inequality? And basically one of his biggest things he talked about was it's very, very important for, first of all, people, such African Americans, minorities, to get in leadership positions, and if they do, to make sure that they're pushing for certain policies and affirmative action on certain things, to make sure they can really try to push some stuff through and become more active than reactive, essentially there. Also talked about as leaders join together, push for education reform, and I think that's obviously really important because we have to find a way to close that gap between our highly skilled and low skilled workers, and depending on what we need to do there. And basically he believes that we need to get to the point as well for especially some of those low ability type workers. We need companies to be searching out for workers, not workers searching out for companies. And that's where a lot of that inner city industry, when it was thriving, people were out and companies were looking for them. That's not so much the case. I thought he had a lot of really good things to say about that. It made a lot of sense. The other individual that was interesting to read about was Jonathan Kozol, and he's very, very well known for his books on the nation's public education system, and he is a major activist for inner city public school system, and that really comes a lot from his background and what he's seen, especially in areas such as St. Louis, and what he has seen there. And reading some of that is very astonishing to hear about the conditions and things there. Can't even imagine some of those as what he described as part of his book. But basically, in his book on savage inequalities, he really went and talked at length about inner city schools in St. Louis, and really described their poverty-stricken environment that has plagued not only places there, but so many different schools. I think so many of us are very, very lucky to be teaching where we are, to have the type of facilities. You read about places such as this, and it's kind of mind-boggling as to what that would actually be like. As far as Kozol, what I found interesting is I read through some of his information. I found a lot of the stuff on funding of public educational systems very interesting. A lot of it comes back to how can we fund it appropriately to make sure that we are giving every student, including low income or at risk students, every possibility to be successful. And one of those I found very interesting is that he mentioned getting rid of the property tax to fund schools, and really try to focus on more of a federal system, or especially the income tax, because he believes that by utilizing only the property taxes, those areas, those districts in high land value areas or have well-to-do, type of parents, they're going to really basically go through, and they're going to strive for that and really push their students to excel, versus areas that aren't so, unfortunately, inner city areas do not have that type of opportunity to create that type of prosperity. So I thought it was very interesting, and it made some sense as far as making sure that we're giving every student those chances. I also found Kozel's views on parents paying for their children's education very interesting, because he has a strong conviction that if able, children need to be attending public schools because of the nature and the fact of what they can provide and different things there, and the fact that basically you mentioned that by paying for the child's education, you may be resisting democracy a little bit in a way. Not saying there's anything wrong with children in a private school, but I can tell you when you have a private school and a public school in the same town, it does create some animosity. Speaking from experience here in West Point, 2 schools, and unfortunately there is everything to go on with that. As far as is there a level playing field? Are we all in it together on the same level? And I think he made some mention of that, and it made a little bit of sense. He also had some very interesting views on our society as it pertains to how we pay for a lot of private things. There's private clubs or private sectors of some type, and we're not willing to keep those public things going. We don't vote with those things going. And really mention how that's matching not only the school system, but it's also becoming a national phenomenon here overall about things we're getting rid of and different things there. And it kind of is a sad truth about public education and what we're seeing there in some places that aren't so fortunate there. And lastly, Kozel was asked about what can we do to help at-risk low-income students. I think we all can speak from experience that I've got a number of those students in my classroom. I think we all can say that we have those students, and we should have some familiarity with that. And what are those things that we're doing? What can we do to help them? And I thought one of those things you mentioned was providing a Head Start program for all children starting at 2.5 years of age, especially low-income students, getting them in early on, getting them habits. That was very interesting, starting them younger. As we know, a lot of the younger they are, the more like the sponge to bring things in. He also mentioned, as I talked earlier, the property tax and making it more equitable funding for every single child, not just a select few in very rich districts or high land value areas. And he also mentioned providing more funding for inner city schools, especially with a high number of low-income students, and trying to really push for younger teachers, really enthusiastic teachers, and maybe even giving them some type of bonus to get them in there and teach for a longer period of time to make sure that that we're giving all those students the best opportunities possible with really talented and enthusiastic type of educators. And I thought that was very interesting to talk about, because I agree with that. The more enthusiasm we put forth, one of the old sayings is nothing good has ever been done without enthusiasm. I think that pertains a lot to education, no matter what students you're looking at, low income, at risk. I think it's very important we provide that for all those students. And the very last thing that was part of the assignment was talking about the election of Barack Obama. And of course, that was a major breakthrough for minorities in that election. With that, as far as has it really had a major impact on diversity and equity? I think, unfortunately, the problem of racial inequality and what we look at with racial equity and those types of things here, I think that will be unfortunately, it's going to be an ongoing issue. We're going to continue to work through that, and it's going to be something that may be with us forever, which is obviously unfortunate. But I think one thing it did do is that with his election, I believe it provided more minorities the sense that they can fulfill those positions of power, that they can be leaders and have more of a voice and all those different things there, and they should have a sense of more equality because of that. So I think it opened up to that, and I think overall it gave a lot of them, especially minority leaders, it should empower them that they can pursue their dreams and their ultimate aspirations and can be very, very good leaders, in certain types of positions. So I think that was very big on that front. But that's all I have for this topic. I hope it has a wonderful rest of your week. Thanks.